One client of mine discovered her tendency to hide financial struggles came directly from her grandmother, who lived through the Great Depression. In her second column, she noted how this secrecy was creating distance in her marriage. In her third column, she envisioned the freedom and support that might come from financial transparency with her partner. This inventory isn't about blame. Your ancestors did the best they could with the tools they had. Instead, it's about awareness, shining light on patterns that have operated in the shadows for generations. And that's principle number 1 of 7. Create your inheritance inventory. This conscious mapping of transmitted patterns is your foundation for everything that follows. Once you clearly see what you've inherited, you can begin the transformative work of choosing which patterns serve you and which ones need to be released. But identifying patterns is just the beginning. How do you separate what's truly yours from what's been impressed upon you? That's where our second principle comes in, which I'll share next. 2. The dichotomy of control reimagined. If you've been following along, you now have your inheritance inventory, a clear map of the patterns you've inherited from previous generations. But awareness alone isn't enough. The question becomes, how do you distinguish between what was programmed into you and what you consciously choose? This brings us to principle number 2 of 7. The dichotomy of control reimagined. The ancient Stoics taught a fundamental concept. Some things are within our control, and some things aren't. But when we apply this to intergenerational patterns, it takes on a powerful new dimension. Think about it this way. You didn't choose the family patterns impressed upon you during your formative years. Those initial impressions were outside your control. But here's the liberating truth. Your judgment about those patterns, how you interpret them, and whether you perpetuate them, that is entirely within your control. I call this the distinction between ancestral impressions and personal judgments. Your grandfather's tendency toward emotional withdrawal. One client of mine discovered her tendency to hide financial struggles came directly from her grandmother, who lived through the Great Depression. In her second column, she noted how this secrecy was creating distance in her marriage. In her third column, she envisioned the freedom and support that might come from financial transparency with her partner. This inventory isn't about blame. Your ancestors did the best they could with the tools they had. Instead, it's about awareness, shining light on patterns that have operated in the shadows for generations. And that's principle number 1 of 7. Create your inheritance inventory. This conscious mapping of transmitted patterns is your foundation for everything that follows. Once you clearly see what you've inherited, you can begin the transformative work of choosing which patterns serve you and which ones need to be released. But identifying patterns is just the beginning. How do you separate what's truly yours from what's been impressed upon you? That's where our second principle comes in, which I'll share next. 2. The dichotomy of control reimagined. If you've been following along, you now have your inheritance inventory, a clear map of the patterns you've inherited from previous generations. But awareness alone isn't enough. The question becomes, how do you distinguish between what was programmed into you and what you consciously choose? This brings us to principle number 2 of 7. The dichotomy of control reimagined. The ancient Stoics taught a fundamental concept. Some things are within our control, and some things aren't. But when we apply this to intergenerational patterns, it takes on a powerful new dimension. Think about it this way. You didn't choose the family patterns impressed upon you during your formative years. Those initial impressions were outside your control. But here's the liberating truth. Your judgment about those patterns, how you interpret them, and whether you perpetuate them, that is entirely within your control. I call this the distinction between ancestral impressions and personal judgments. Your grandfather's tendency toward emotional withdrawal wasn't something you chose to inherit, but your perspective on that pattern and whether you continue it, that's where your power lies. Let me introduce you to the lineage liberation technique. This practice involves tracing a harmful belief or behavior back to where it first appeared in your family history. One client discovered her perfectionism wasn't a personal failing, but began with her great-grandmother, who used flawless homemaking as her only available form of control in an otherwise restrictive life. Understanding the origin of a pattern doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. And explanation creates space for compassion and change. Now, here's where this principle becomes truly practical in daily life. I want you to start identifying what I call breaking points, those precise moments when you shift from ancestral programming to conscious choice. These breaking points often appear as triggers. Someone says something that instantly activates an old family pattern. For example, one man I worked with would completely shut down whenever his partner asked about his feelings. A perfect replica of his father's behavior. His breaking point came when he felt that initial impulse to withdraw. With practice, he learned to recognize that moment as a choice point rather than an automatic response. The dichotomy becomes clear. The trigger isn't in your control, but your response to it absolutely is. This is where freedom emerges, in that tiny space between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl so eloquently described. Start watching for these breaking points in your own life. When do you feel yourself slipping into inherited patterns? Can you catch yourself in that crucial moment? With practice, these breaking points transform from moments of automatic reaction to opportunities for conscious choice. And that's principle number 2 of 7. The dichotomy of control reimagined. By separating what was impressed upon you from your power to reframe it, you reclaim your agency in the present moment. But how do you make peace with painful patterns without denying their impact? That's where our third principle comes in, which I'll explain next. 3. Amor fati, love of fate, as radical reconciliation. Now that you understand how to identify your breaking points, those moments when ancestral patterns try to take control, we can move to something deeper. How do you come to terms with painful family legacies without minimizing their impact? This brings us to principle number 3 of 7. Amor fati as radical reconciliation. Amor fati, love of fate, is a cornerstone of Stoic philosophy. But I'm not talking about toxic positivity or spiritual bypassing. This isn't about pretending everything in your family history was perfect. Instead, it's about acknowledging trauma while refusing to be defined by it. True reconciliation with your past requires a delicate balance. You must honor the reality of what happened while simultaneously claiming your power to determine what it means for your future. Let me introduce you to what I call the generational strength audit. This practice invites you to look at how survival mechanisms of your ancestors, even destructive ones, can be transformed into conscious strengths. For example, a grandmother's hypervigilance during war might have manifested as anxiety in your mother and controlling behavior in you. But that same vigilance, when consciously channeled, becomes exceptional attention to detail and situational awareness. Valuable strengths in many contexts. One woman I worked with realized her family's pattern of emotional guardedness, which caused her relationship difficulties, stemmed from her ancestors surviving severe persecution. The same protective instinct that helped them survive now existed in her as exceptional discernment about whom to trust. Once recognized, she could honor the protective intention while choosing more vulnerability with selected individuals. This brings us to a powerful perspective shift. Asking, what if this was necessary? This isn't about excusing harm or claiming abuse was somehow good. Rather, it's about finding meaning and purpose in inherited pain without diminishing its reality. Perhaps your family's struggles with addiction taught you compassion for human frailty. Maybe your parents' financial instability developed your resourcefulness. These insights don't justify the suffering, but can transform its legacy. When you practice amor fati as radical reconciliation, something profound happens. You move from being a victim of your history to becoming its conscious interpreter. You honor the full truth of your lineage, both its wounds and its wisdom. And that's principle number 3 of 7. Amor fati as radical reconciliation. By reframing without bypassing, conducting a generational strength audit, and finding purpose in inherited pain, you transform your relationship with your ancestral past. But reconciliation isn't enough. How do you actually interrupt these deeply ingrained patterns when they emerge? That's where our 4th principle comes in, which I'll share next. 4. Memento mori, remember death, as pattern interruption. By now, you've created your inheritance inventory, identified your breaking points, and begun the process of reconciliation with your family patterns. But when you're in the heat of the moment, when those old patterns come roaring back, how do you actually stop them? This brings us to principle number 4 of 7. Memento mori as pattern interruption. Memento mori, remember death, might sound morbid, but the Stoics understood something profound. Awareness of our finite time creates clarity about what truly matters. When applied to breaking intergenerational patterns, this principle becomes a powerful catalyst for change. I call this legacy consciousness, the awareness that your time is limited, and with it, your opportunity to break cycles that have persisted for generations. When you truly internalize that you won't live forever, the urgency to heal now rather than perpetuate harmful patterns becomes undeniable. Try this, the deathbed perspective technique. Imagine yourself at the end of your life, looking backward. Would you be content knowing you passed down the same patterns you struggled with? Or would you feel profound satisfaction knowing you were the circuit breaker, the one who stopped the transmission of pain to future generations? One father I worked with struggled with emotional distance, a pattern that stretched back 3 generations in his family. When he visualized himself at life's end, he saw clearly that continuing this pattern would be his deepest regret. This visualization wasn't a morbid exercise, but a clarifying one that motivated immediate change in how he connected with his children. But legacy consciousness alone isn't enough. You need practical tools for those moments when you feel yourself sliding into old patterns. This is where the pattern interruption protocol comes in, specific physical and mental practices to deploy when triggered. Here's how it works. When you notice yourself engaging in an inherited pattern, immediately 1. Create physical distance if possible. Literally step back or change your position. 2. Take 3 deep breaths while silently saying, "This is not my fate, this is a pattern." 3. Ask yourself, what would breaking the cycle look like in this moment? One client who inherited a tendency to withdraw during conflict would excuse herself for 30 seconds, practice this protocol, and return to conversations with a new response. Within weeks, her relationships transformed. Remember, neural pathways get stronger with use. Each time you interrupt an old pattern and choose a new response, you're literally rewiring your brain. You're not just changing your behavior, you're changing your legacy. And that's principle number 4 of 7. Memento mori as pattern interruption. By developing legacy consciousness, applying the deathbed perspective, and implementing specific pattern interruption practices, you create space for new choices in critical moments. But what about the invisible audience of ancestral judgment that often holds us back? That's where our fifth principle comes in, which I'll explain next. Practical indifference to ancestral judgment. If you've been applying the principles we've covered so far, you might have noticed something interesting. Even as you work to break old patterns, there's often an invisible chorus of ancestral voices judging your efforts. This brings us to principle number 5 of 7. Practical indifference to ancestral judgment. The Stoics taught the value of indifference toward things outside our control. Not in the sense of not caring, but in the sense of not letting external judgments dictate our choices. When breaking intergenerational patterns, developing this indifference toward ancestral judgment is essential. Let me introduce you to what I call the ghost audience effect. Many of us live with an internalized audience of ancestors, parents, grandparents, and sometimes people we've never even met, whose imagined judgments still influence our decisions. Their voices whisper, "That's not how we do things," or "What would people think?" One woman I worked with realized she had abandoned multiple creative projects because whenever she started, she could hear her grandfather's voice telling her that art wasn't practical. Another client continued in a miserable career path because deviating from the family profession felt like betrayal to ancestors who had sacrificed to establish it. The first step toward freedom is identifying exactly whose voices still have power over your choices. Which ancestors' judgments do you still fear, even if they're no longer alive? Whose approval do you still seek across time and space? Once you've identified these voices, it's time for the permission slip practice. This isn't childish, it's profound. Write formal declarations of freedom from specific ancestral expectations. For example, I release myself from Grandmother Helen's expectation that women should always prioritize others' needs above their own. One client ceremonially burned these permission slips, finding enormous release in this symbolic act. Another keeps them in a special box, adding new ones as she identifies more ancestral expectations to release. Finally, conduct what I call a value alignment check. Are your healing choices reflecting your authentic values, or are they merely reactions against family patterns? True freedom isn't found in reflexively doing the opposite of your ancestors. It's found in consciously choosing based on your own values. For instance, if your family valued material success above all else, your healing might not be found in rejecting all ambition, but in pursuing success, defined by your own metrics of meaning and fulfillment. When you develop practical indifference to ancestral judgment, you free yourself to honor the best of your heritage while releasing what no longer serves. You can appreciate your ancestors' journeys without being bound by their limitations. You can say both thank you and no thank you to different aspects of your inheritance. And that's principle number 5 of 7. Practical indifference to ancestral judgment. By identifying the ghost audience effect, practicing formal declarations of freedom, and ensuring your choices reflect your authentic values, you liberate yourself from the weight of ancestral expectations. But what about your living family? How do you communicate about these changes without creating new wounds? That's where our 6th principle comes in, which I'll share next. 6. The Stoic approach to intergenerational communication. By now, you're well on your way to breaking harmful patterns from your family lineage. But there's an important aspect we haven't addressed. How do you talk about these changes with your actual family? This brings us to principle number 6 of 7. The Stoic approach to intergenerational communication. When you begin breaking family patterns, it creates ripples. Family members might feel implicitly criticized or defensive about traditions you're choosing to leave behind. The Stoics valued truth, but they also understood the importance of how that truth is communicated. I want to introduce you to a practice I call truth without blame. This approach allows you to discuss family patterns with relatives without triggering defensive reactions. The key is to speak about your own experience, rather than making proclamations about the family system. Instead of saying, "Our family has a toxic pattern of avoiding conflict," try, "I've noticed I learned to avoid difficult conversations, and I'm working on changing that in myself." The difference is subtle but profound. One statement feels like an accusation. The other shares your personal journey. One client was terrified to tell her mother she was in therapy working through family trauma. When she framed it as her personal growth journey rather than a commentary on her upbringing, her mother surprised her by being supportive. Next, practice what I call the curious observer technique during family interactions. This involves maintaining emotional distance, not detachment, but perspective, when family dynamics activate old patterns. Imagine you're an anthropologist studying an interesting culture, rather than a participant caught in the emotional current. During a holiday gathering, instead of being pulled into familiar arguments, observe, "Interesting. This is the exact point where our conversations typically escalate." This mental stance prevents you from falling into reactive cycles that have played out for generations. Finally, set boundaries based on reality-based expectations. The Stoics emphasized seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be. When it comes to family, this means acknowledging each member's capacity for change rather than expecting transformations they're not ready for. Your father might never become the emotionally expressive parent you needed in childhood. But you can set boundaries that protect your well-being while still maintaining connection where possible. Perhaps you'll visit for shorter periods, or have prepared responses when old dynamics emerge. One man I worked with realized his mother would likely never stop offering unsolicited advice. Rather than cutting contact or getting frustrated repeatedly, he developed a simple phrase, "Thank you for caring about me," that acknowledged her intention without engaging with the specific advice. When you adopt the Stoic approach to intergenerational communication, family interactions become opportunities for practice rather than painful reminders of what hasn't changed. You can honor your healing journey without demanding that everyone join you on it. And that's principle number 6 of 7, the Stoic approach to intergenerational communication. By practicing truth without blame, maintaining the perspective of a curious observer, and setting boundaries based on realistic expectations, you transform how you communicate about the changes you're making. But breaking patterns isn't just about what you're leaving behind. It's also about what you're creating instead. That's where our 7th and final principle comes in, which I'll share next. 7. The discipline of action. Creating new lineage patterns. We've reached our 7th and final principle, the discipline of action. Creating new lineage patterns. Everything we've covered so far prepares you for this culminating work. Actively creating new traditions and patterns that will shape not just your life, but potentially generations to come. The Stoics emphasize that philosophy without action is empty. Similarly, understanding your inherited patterns without creating alternatives leaves a vacuum that old habits will quickly refill. This final principle is about concrete action, becoming the architect of a new family legacy. Let's begin with what I call deliberate tradition creation. This involves establishing new family practices that directly counter harmful inherited ones. If your family legacy includes emotional distance during difficulty, create regular check-ins with loved ones specifically focused on authentic sharing. If celebration was always tinged with criticism, establish rituals that emphasize unconditional appreciation. One couple I worked with came from families where conflict led to days of silent treatment. They created a new tradition, the repair ritual, a specific process they follow after arguments to restore connection quickly. Their young children are already learning this pattern instead of the avoidance both parents inherited. To cement these new patterns, I recommend the 90-day pattern replacement protocol. Neuroscience shows that consistent practice over at least 3 months helps establish new neural pathways. Choose one specific inherited pattern to focus on, identify your desired alternative, and commit to practicing this new response daily for a full 90 days. Track your progress. Note triggers, successes, and challenges. One client used a simple app to record each time she responded to her children's mistakes with curiosity instead of the harsh criticism she had experienced. By day 90, the new response had become her default. Finally, practice what I call legacy consciousness journaling. Document your healing journey, insights, breakthroughs, setbacks, and victories. This isn't just for yourself, it's a resource for future generations. Imagine if your grandparents had left you an honest record of their inner work and healing efforts. What gift might that have been? One man I worked with created what he calls his unlearning journal, documentation of each family pattern he's working to transform. He plans to share this with his teenage son when the time is right, hoping to both normalize healing work and provide a roadmap. Remember, you're not just changing your life, you're potentially altering the trajectory of your lineage. The work you're doing now may benefit people who won't be born for decades. This isn't pressure, it's perspective that can sustain you when change feels difficult. The poet Rumi wrote, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself." In breaking intergenerational patterns, you embody this wisdom. By changing yourself with intention, compassion, and persistence, you change the future. And that's principle number 7 of 7. The discipline of action, creating new lineage patterns. By deliberately creating new traditions, following the 90-day pattern replacement protocol, and documenting your journey for future generations, you become not just a pattern breaker, but a legacy builder. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our exploration of these 7 Stoic principles for breaking intergenerational patterns, I want to acknowledge the courage this work requires. Looking unflinchingly at family legacies isn't easy. Choosing different paths can feel lonely. Creating new patterns demands persistent effort. But consider this. Somewhere in your family history, someone dreamed of the freedom you're now creating. Someone hoped their descendants would heal what they couldn't. In doing this work, you honor not just your future, but also the deepest hopes of your ancestors. The beauty of applying Stoic wisdom to intergenerational healing is that it balances clear-eyed reality with profound hope. Yes, patterns run deep. Yes, change is challenging, but within you lies the capacity for choice, and in that capacity lives true freedom. Whether you implement all 7 principles or start with just one, remember that this isn't about achieving perfection. It's about bringing consciousness to what was unconscious, choice to what was automatic, and love to what was wounded. You stand at a powerful crossroads between what was inherited and what will be transmitted. By applying these principles with patience and persistence, you become what your lineage has perhaps waited generations for, the one who transforms the inheritance. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May your healing ripple outward through time in ways you might never fully witness, but are no less profound for being unseen.